Hello, and welcome to Encounters with Polish Literature, brought to you by the Polish Cultural Institute, New York. I'm David Goldfarb, and I'll be your host. That was a scene from the center of Warsaw, not too far from where much of the action in Bolesław Prus's novel, The Doll, takes place. But before we get to Prus, which is the subject of our episode today, I'd like to talk a little bit about what we're seeing as a kind of crisis of literacy described in the media. There was an article in October of 2024 claiming that, in The Atlantic, claiming that students in elite colleges can't read books because they didn't read books in high school, maybe because of the pandemic, they got out of the habit, maybe because of artificial intelligence. People are looking too quickly at summaries, which they used to do using things like Cliff Notes and Spark Notes before AI. And that is causing an inability to think critically for a sustained amount of time over a difficult text. And I've heard anecdotes from my colleagues who are currently teaching that everything that they read from their students is infected with this boilerplate, bland language of AI, of ChatGPT. I compare it to the language of clickbait. You know, when you get one of those, some provocative question like, or statement like, this doctor claims that every American should throw away this vegetable. And then you click on it and you find out, you want to know, well, what's the vegetable that I should throw away? And you start reading, and then there's an ad, and then you start reading some more, and then there's another ad, and you read some more, and then there's another ad. And after about 5 minutes of this, you realize you're never going to get the answer, and you're never going to find out what the dang vegetable is. The way it does that is it gives you this very ambivalent language, a non-committal language. So you don't know which way it's going to go, this way or that way. And when students start writing that way, then we have to think about why that is and how we could improve it. So I want to think about, how we read and what we should look at. I mean, first of all, what I would, because I understand, that sometimes, we all face this, all of us who write about literature or write about anything, spend some time staring at the blank page. And, I know from my own son who just graduated high school, that sometimes, he would think, all right, well, what if I asked, how would ChatGPT, start this essay? And he doesn't copy it exactly, but he uses it kind of for, to jog his memory, for inspiration, to get the juices flowing. And what I would suggest, because usually that writing in, AI and so forth is so bland and non-committal and boilerplate, look at some other criticism, that's well written, that's written by somebody who's really thought about the text that they want to write about, who spent some time on it. Maybe, if somebody writes a scholarly article, that sometimes they can do it in a few months. Sometimes it takes years. You got something brewing, and you let it go for a while. So look at sources like the MLA bibliography for articles that are in peer-reviewed journals by scholars who do research, and see what some serious people have written, and read the footnotes and see, what are the footnotes that everybody cites in all of the articles that you read, because those are probably the fundamental sources. So you'll know to look for those. Maybe it's a book that you have to get from the library. Maybe it's an article that'll be available online through a resource like JSTOR or Project Muse, or Cambridge has an online portal for their journals. And you can even use Google to get to those sources, or you can use your university library if you're a student at university, or if you have access to a research library. Say you're not a student, probably there's a research library that you might have access to, which could be at a public university. It could be at a public research library, such as the New York Public Library or the Cleveland Public Library. That's the town where I grew up. And those are places that you can find really serious resources written by thoughtful people who have done some real research, and not the kind of random stuff that's cobbled together by AI. My academic colleague, Eric Nyman at the University of California, Berkeley, gave a wonderful commencement address this year, 2025, about exactly, this issue, about this question of the use of AI. And he said, some of his students, a lot of his students are producing this bland stuff. But he's also saying that he's seeing some of the best writing he's ever seen from the class of 2025. And he's asked them, why might that be? And he said, well, some of them, took the easy way out and, started using, AI to, write or partially write their papers. But some of them just got bored during the pandemic and they started to read. And they were reading books for pleasure, but also, they filtered their way into their schoolwork. And that, made them more careful thinkers, more thoughtful people. It expanded their vocabulary. It expanded their, bank of ideas in their heads. And it's made them better writers than we've ever had. So, I don't think that the pandemic and AI are a total loss. That there were some things to be gained just by, sometimes being alone in a room with your ideas and a good book. So maybe we should think a little bit about how to read as a scholar or a critic. And I've done some of this previously in other episodes, but maybe we can condense it here. So first of all, I recommend, if you're reading a especially big novel like Bolesław Prus's The Doll, keep a character list, because it's hard to remember everything. And after all, many novels are quasi-biographical in nature. So you're following the lives of the characters. So all of the ideas of the novel are hanging on those quasi-biographies. So it's good to keep track of them. Write down the page number where a character is introduced, where you get a physical description or a psychological description of who they are. That's also useful. If you decide to write about the novel, then you'll be able to use those page numbers to find citations that are useful for your writing. Be aware of the space of the novel. Keep a list of locations, just like you keep a list of characters. Is there an apartment? Is there a store? Are you out on the public street? Are you in the countryside? Are you in another country? Are you on another planet in the case of a science fiction novel? And think in terms of Jean Baudrillard's Poetics of Space. Interiority and exteriority, because space is also a metaphor, and they're metaphorical spaces that are important to how we read. For instance, when we get a character's perspective, are we seeing what they look at and what they see of other characters, of other action that's taking place in the work, or are we getting their internal monologue? So is it interior or exterior? Are they looking inward or looking outward? That's also important. Does the narrator get in the minds of the interior of animals, plants, inanimate objects? Do we get, the thoughts of a dog, of a horse, of a tree? It sounds ridiculous sometimes, but there are novels where that happens. And that's interesting. It tells you about what is the consciousness of the novel. Think about narration. Are we seeing, we all learn about, first-person narration, which is limited and is one person's perspective, versus third-person narration, which might be omniscient and, a perspective of, looking from above, at every character, looking forward in space and backward in time. But you have to ask, what does the narrator really know in the work that you're reading at the time? So sometimes a first-person narrator may know more than they should. Maybe the novelist is a little undisciplined about the boundaries of what a first-person narrator can know. And sometimes the third-person narrator gets into the mind of the character. That's called free indirect discourse. And then we're not really omniscient. We're like sort of, it's like the narrator is omniscient, right? But is giving you a kind of limited perspective just for maybe a few pages or maybe a paragraph or something like that. Just giving you the thought of one of the characters, moving in and out of the consciousness of different characters. Think about the time of the work. Does time unfold day by day, or is it, the long ago and far away of like an epic or a fairy tale, something like that? The Doll was first serialized in 1887. And the action of the novel takes place in 1878. So, the action of the novel takes place 9 years before it started appearing in a newspaper, really, with nonfiction articles all around it, unfolding in the same time pattern as the time of the novel. So the readers of that day would have known about the events being described, would have, recognized the kinds of scenes that are described in the novel. And, what I recommend is, you might make a timeline, underline all the time references, because we get dates in the novel and we get references to something that happened yesterday and something that happened 3 months from now and, something that happened in the historic past in 1840 and all those things. And, that can help you decide, like, all right, how much time is covered in the main action of the novel, the main narrative. But then how much time is referred to? Because sometimes we get like a character's, description of his childhood or a description of a historical event in the past of the time of Napoleon Bonaparte or something like that. And that's good to be aware of. Know, like, how does time unfold and how is it laid out in the novel? And then once you've established time and space, you can start thinking about the relationship between time and space, which the Russian critic Mikhail Bakhtin called the chronotope. So the chronotope of the novel has to do with things like, all right, say we're imagining a novel, like a road novel, like Kerouac's On the Road. That's a case where the distance covered is proportional to the time covered in the novel. So think about that. How do they relate to each other? Does time move more slowly? Like, say you have a novel of the country and the city. Does time move more slowly in the country than it does in the city? Well, maybe you can describe that when you're writing about the work. Those are important things. So let's ask, who was Bolesław Prus? Bolesław Prus was originally his real name was that was a pen name. His name was Alexander Głowacki. And he lived from 1847 to 1912. And he was born of the kind of impoverished nobility not too far from Lublin. His father worked on an estate, and he was orphaned at a rather young age. He joined the uprising of 1863 against Russia, like the main character of the doll, whose name is Stanisław Wokulski. He became interested in science at a young age in the works of Herbert Spencer, and that, affects what kind of writer he was. I mean, he was part of a movement that was known as positivism that had to do with, positivism had, kind of a political agenda, but it also meant a kind of objectivism, a kind of scientific outlook, rather than idealism, which was characteristic of the Romantic era. Just being aware of how things were. He began his studies at the famous Szkoła Główna in Warsaw, the main school, as it was called, which became eventually what's today the University of Warsaw. But he couldn't afford to finish, so he worked in a metal factory, a metallurgical factory for a while, and he began to publish short works, editorials, which are known as feuilleton or feuilletony in Polish, and he began to write humor, and his work is very humorous. Before he progressed to fiction and eventually these lengthy novels, and his other novels are. The Outpost, published in 1886, Placówka, Emancypantki, The Emancipationists, The Emancipationist Women, published in 1894, the novel Pharaon, which is translated into English. There's a recent translation. There's also a older translation by Jeremiah Curtin, and that was published between 1894 and 95. And his late work, Dzieci, or Children, published in 1905. That one might be translated. And many of his stories are translated. There's a wonderful collection published by Northwestern, translated by Bill Johnston, of Prus's stories, which I recommend. Okay, let's get to the business of the novel at hand, The Doll. The novel starts, and we want to start with the characters, and that's how the work starts, with the main character, Stanisław Wokulski. He's a merchant. He's a member of the rising middle class. He represents social advancement in the novel. He advances rather in an interesting way. He marries an older widow, the wife of a certain Jan Menzel, who owns some shop that sells haberdashery, men's clothing and accessories. Sells also, soap. And what else? Oh, and groceries. And eventually what he does is he discovers that haberdashery is the most profitable part of the business. So he focuses it on that. It grows the business, as they like to say. He builds the business. The widow dies. So it becomes his shop by inheritance. But then he starts investing money abroad, and he's following politics, international politics, which at this time in Europe means war. And he may be involved, we never quite know for sure, but he may be involved in the arms trade in some way. And he makes a huge fortune, right? Many times what he could make as a haberdasher in Warsaw. And he's a much beloved character, right? A character that, is considered, real in the way that, Dickens' most lively characters are, like, say Scrooge or the Ghost of Christmas Past, or something like that. And so much so that there's even a plaque in Warsaw that says it's on the street called Krakowskie Przedmieście number 4, right near the Polish Academy of Sciences, and across the street from the statue of Copernicus near the center of town, where it says in Bolesław Prus's novel, this was the residence of Stanisław Wokulski, and he fought in the January Uprising of 1863, and he, in the novel, established a shop and all these things, as if he were a real person, because that's the nature of realism, right? I mean, that the characters are so realistic. You can, if a character goes for a walk, you can look at a map. He's, gone abroad and come back with a lot of money, and that's really, and he's a widower, right? That's one of the central problems of the 19th century realist novel, right? I mean, we only need to think of the opening line of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. It is a truth universally acknowledged, there's a little satire there, that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. That's Wokulski's issue, right? I mean, he wants more fulfillment than running a shop, but this is also a time of social mobility. So how does that happen? He needs to prove himself, and he goes abroad and does it. But also, he needs to marry up if he can, right? Marry into the gentry, which was the old, sort of top level class in Polish society, and is now declining. So he's thinking about that, and he's. He has desires. He says he separates himself from the earlier romantics by saying, I'm not a Christ to sacrifice for mankind. He has things he wants to achieve, and there's a woman that he's in love with, and her name is Izabela Łęcka, and she's of an aristocratic family, so satisfies his need to move up in society. And of course, she has her own desires and her own interests, and is struggling with this question of downward mobility from her side, as is her father, Tomasz Łęcki, who is another character in the novel. Let's maybe take a little look at this opening chapter and read some of it and see what we can extract from it. So this chapter is called The Firm of J. Mincel and S. Wokulski, Seen Through a Bottle. So it's presented as an introduction to the business more than to the character. But it is an introduction to the character, I believe. And it starts out early in 1878 when the political world was concerned with the Treaty of San Stefano, which was the treaty between Russia and Turkey that liberated many of the Balkan states, the election of a new pope, who was Leo XIII, and the chances of a European war. Warsaw businessmen and the intelligentsia who frequented a certain spot in the Krakowskie Przedmieście, this main street that leads into the old town of Warsaw, were no less keenly interested in the future of the haberdashery firm of J. Mincel and S. Wokulski. In a celebrated restaurant where the proprietors of linen stores or wine shops, carriage and hat makers, solemn paterfamilias living on their incomes, and the owners of apartment houses with no fixed occupation met to partake of refreshments in the evening, as much was said of the arming of England as of the firm of J. Mincel and S. Wokulski. Surrounded by clouds of cigar smoke and sitting over dark bottles, some of the citizens of this neighborhood bet that England would win or lose. Others bet on Wokulski's likely bankruptcy. Some called Bismarck a genius. Others declared Wokulski an irresponsible adventurer. Some critiqued the behavior of President McMahon, while others declared that Wokulski was certainly a lunatic, if not something worse. And this is a blending of the local and the global, right? And it gives you a sense of, I said we should think about time and place. So what's happening here? This is like one evening in 1878, just 9 years before the beginning of the publication of the novel. People are talking about, world affairs, and they're also talking about local affairs. This particular shop, is this guy going to go bankrupt? And so we're going to be introduced to Wokulski by these, through gossip. So what we're doing here is we're going to learn about Wokulski by eavesdropping a little on what other people are saying. The sociologist Serge Moscovici from the New School for Social Research in New York called this the theory of social representations. This was his method of, listening to overheard speech and trying to figure out, well, when people talk among themselves, what do they mean by a certain idea? When they're talking about, say, race or sexuality or something like that. And he would have his students do research by, sitting in cafes and overhearing conversations. And that's what we're doing when we read the first chapter of this novel. And also, we should think about, this is, starts to appear in 1887. This is just 1 year after the appearance of Tolstoy's short story, or some may think of it as a novella, The Death of Ivan Ilyich. And it starts in exactly this way. There are a number of people, and they're reading the Ivan Ilyich is a magistrate who has just died, and there are a number of people who are reading, his obituary in the newspaper, and they're gossiping about him, and what was it that killed him, and what happened to him, and and they're thinking about his career, and this is very much like that scene that was published just 1 year before the novel. So maybe we can figure that Prus, who lived in Warsaw, was part of the Russian Empire, maybe he had read Tolstoy's story as well. Mr. Deklevsky, the carriage manufacturer who owed all his fortune and position to steady work in one and the same trade, and Counselor Węgrowicz, a lawyer who had for 20 years been a member and patron of one and the same charitable institution, had known Wokulski longest, and it was they who most vociferously predicted his ruin. Ruin and insolvency, said Mr. Deklevsky, must finish off a man who never sticks to a trade and doesn't know how to respect the gifts of fortune. Whereas Counselor Węgrowicz added to each of his friends' aphorisms, a lunatic, an adventurer. Joe, another beer here. How many does that make? The sixth already, sir. Coming, replied Joe. He's the waiter. The sixth already. How time flies, to be sure. He's a lunatic. That's what Counselor Węgrowicz muttered. And Counselor Węgrowicz is going to, be drinking more and more beers. I mean, he's already on his sixth, right? And that's kind of a little bit of humor that runs through this chapter. I don't know if we'll have time to read the whole thing. So, they're speculating. They think, well, what is he doing? Somebody says, well, maybe he'll do it. Army supplies is a good business, said Sprott, the traveling salesman, who was an infrequent visitor here. So maybe he's involved in, the arms trade, or maybe it's just army supplies. Maybe he's selling uniforms. He's a haberdasher, after all. Then Deklevsky comes back. He'll do nothing. And in the meantime, a reputable shop is going to the dogs. Only the Germans and the Jews get rich from the army trade. We Poles haven't the brains for it. Well, maybe he does. And that reveals some stereotypes that are functioning in, that's the kind of thing that Serge Moscovici would have investigated. Stereotypes, what do people say about the Jews? What do people say about the Germans in a cafe like this? Then somebody else says, well, maybe Wokulski has. Maybe he's mastered it. He's a lunatic, the lawyer muttered. Here, Joe, another beer. How many does that make? The seventh, sir. Coming. The seventh already. How time flies, to be sure. And so that's another, element of the we were talking at the beginning about the chronotope, right? The relationship of time to space. Well, how are we measuring time? Well, we're measuring the time in the number of beers that Węgrowicz is drinking. And then we get a little bio of Wokulski within this, not from his perspective, but from this external perspective. In 1860, he worked as a waiter in a restaurant called Hopfer's Restaurant. He was already over 20. In the food and drink trade, eh? Just so. And like Joe here, he used to serve me my beef Nelson and beer. That's a zrazy Nelson, as it's called in Polish. Zrazy Nelsonskie, properly. Then he transferred from that line of business to haberdashery, asked the traveling salesman. Not so fast, if you please, the lawyer interrupted. He transferred, certainly, but not to haberdashery. Instead, he went to the preparatory college and then to the city college. He wanted to become a scholar, you'd see. The commercial traveler nodded to express his surprise. Just think of that, he said. What put that into his head? Well, it was the same old business. He knew people at the medical academy and the School of Fine Arts. In those days, everyone was crazy with ideas, and he didn't want to be behind the rest of them. So, by day, he waited on customers in the restaurant and did the accounts, and by night, he studied. The service must have gone to the devil. No more than anywhere else, the lawyer replied, with a deprecatory gesture, except that when he was waiting on you, he was a holy terror. He'd scowl like thunder at the most innocent word. It stands to reason we amused ourselves at his expense, and what vexed him most was to be called doctor. One fine day he went for a customer, and they very nearly tore one another to pieces. Business suffered, of course. Not at all. When the news got around that Hopfer's waiter wanted to go to the preparatory college, crowds would go there for dinner. It was crowded out with students in particular. And did he get into the college? He did. And he even passed his exam for the city college, yes. But now, the lawyer went on, tapping on the traveling salesman's knee, instead of sticking to his studies till he finished, he left the college in less than a year. And what did he do that for? He and the rest of them sowed the harvest we're still reaping to this day. And in the end, Wokulski finished up somewhere in the neighborhood of Irkutsk. And so the implication there is that he joined the January uprising of 1863. And he was, like many Poles who joined the uprising, he ended up in Siberia. That wasn't all, though. In 1870, he came back to Warsaw with what he'd saved. He'd spent 6 months looking for work, avoiding the wine and food trade, which he hates, until finally the patronage of his present managing clerk, Rzecki, got him into Mrs. Mincel's shop. She'd just become a widow a year later, he married the old girl, who was much older than he. A good move, the traveling salesman interposed. Oh, quite so. At one stroke, he acquired a living in a trade he could stick to calmly for the rest of his days. But he had the devil's own work with the old lady. That's often the way. Too true, said the lawyer. But just think of the luck he had. 18 months ago, the old lady ate too much and died, and Wokulski's hard labor was over. He was free as air. He'd a well-stocked store and 30,000 rubles in cash, for which 2 generations of the Mincels had toiled, right? So here he is. That's his first fortune before he goes abroad and makes this money, somehow in the arms trade, perhaps. He's a lucky fellow, all right. He was, the lawyer amended, but he didn't appreciate it. Another fellow in his place would have married a nice girl and settled down. Just think what a shop and a good name means these days. And one in a good location, too, but this lunatic threw it all away and went off to do business in the war. It was millions he wanted, that's what. So they're speculating, well, maybe he's too greedy. Maybe he'll do it, the commercial traveler remarked. He's always hopeful, after all. The lawyer grunted. Joe, another beer. Do you think, my dear sir, that he'll find a richer old lady in Turkey than the late Mrs. Minsel? Joe, coming, sir. The 8th coming up? The 8th, the lawyer echoed. It can't be. Just a minute there. 'Twas the 6th just now, and then the 7th, and he grunted, covering his face with one hand. Maybe it's the 8th after all. How time flies, to be sure. And then, we're moving from this kind of conversation to a kind of third-person omniscient, where we have various people presenting their ideas and the first person arguing among themselves, to a third-person omniscient narrator. Despite the mournful prognostications of sober people, maybe they're not all so sober, the haberdashery store of J. Minsel and S. Wokulski did not collapse into ruin, but even profited. The public was intrigued by the rumors of bankruptcy and visited the store in increasing numbers, and since Wokulski's departure, Russian merchants were coming to his store to order merchandise. Orders increased, credit was available, and bills were paid regularly. And the shop was thronged with so many customers that the 3 clerks could barely cope. Of these 3, one was a lanky fair youth who looked as if he might become consumptive and die any minute, the second a dark youth with a philosopher's beard and princely gestures, while the third was a young dandy who wore mustaches the fair sex found fatal, and which were perfumed like a chemical laboratory into the bargain. However, the curiosity of the public, the physical and moral graces of the 3 clerks, and even the solid reputation of the shop could not have saved it from rack and ruin had it not been for an employee of the firm for the last 40 years, Wokulski's old friend and managing clerk, Ignacy Rzecki. And then, in the next chapter, we get what's called the reign of the old clerk. And here I won't read the whole thing, but we have retrospective time, memory. We get images of childhood. We get images of Louis Napoleon. So before we have, kind of calendric time, things, unfolding in the present, a conversation, at a restaurant on Krakowskie Przedmieście, perhaps. And now we're in the realm of memory. From this, we learn that Rzecki keeps a private journal, and we're going to get chapters of Rzecki's private journal. And Rzecki is kind of like the Greek chorus in this novel. He's the person who's, he's writing just for himself because he wants to show, how one becomes a good clerk. Rzecki is writing his diary, and then somebody knocks on the door, and it turns out to be Wokulski, returned from his adventures associated in some way with business related to the Russo-Turkish War. Well, and how did things go with you? Asked Ignacy in his normal voice. Wokulski's eyes gleamed. He put down the bread and leaned against the arm of the sofa. Do you remember, he asked, how much money I took with me when I went abroad? And then Rzecki replies, 30,000 rubles in cash. After all, he keeps the book, so he knows how much money there is. And remember, this is how much money Wokulski inherited from Minsel's wife when she died, his subsequent wife. And so he's essentially betting the farm. He's going to Turkey and to engage in some kind of business, and he's bringing all of his cash. And how much do you suppose I brought back? 50, perhaps 40,000 rubles, am I right? Asked Rzecki, looking at him uncertainly. Wokulski poured a glass of wine and drank it slowly. 250,000 rubles, mostly in gold, he said distinctly. And since I told them to buy banknotes, which I'll sell when the peace is signed, I shall have over 300,000 rubles. Rzecki leaned toward him, his mouth open. "Don't be alarmed," Wokulski went on. "I made it honestly, by very hard work. The secret was that I had a rich partner and was satisfied with 4 or 5 times less profit than others. So my capital, while continually growing, was in constant circulation. Well," he added after a time, "I was very lucky, too. Like a gambler who backs the same number 10 times running at roulette. High stakes? Nearly every month I risked my entire fortune and my life every day." "Was that the only reason you went there?" Ignaz asked. Wokulski looked at him mockingly. "Surely you don't expect me to turn into a Turkish Wallenrod." So now that's a reference to Mickiewicz's poem Konrad Wallenrod, where essentially what Wokulski's implying is that, well, he's not going to martyr himself like some romantic hero for the sake of defeating Russia, for the sake of the Polish nation. What Wallenrod did was he infiltrated the Teutonic Knights in order to eventually defeat them. But he would always be remembered as a traitor, even though in fact he was a patriot. So that was Wallenrod's sacrifice. Rzecki says, "But to risk your neck for money when you had a good living?" Ignaz muttered, shaking his head and raising his eyebrows. Wokulski shuddered and jumped up. "That good living," he said, clenching his fist, "was stifling me, and it stifled me for 6 years. Don't you remember how many times a day I was reminded of the 2 generations of Mincels, or of the angelic goodness of my late wife? Was there anyone among my closest or not-so-close acquaintances, except you, who did not torment me with a word, gesture, or look? How often was it said of me, and almost to me, that I was tied to my wife's apron strings, that I owed every penny to the industry of the Mincels, and nothing at all to my own efforts, though it was I who built up the shop and doubled its profits. The Mincels, it was always the Mincels. Why don't they compare me to the Mincels now? In 6 months, I made 10 times the money that 2 generations of Mincels made in a half century." So he was out to prove himself. And why does he want to prove himself? Well, of course, it's self-realization, but also he wants to win over Isabella Wenska. He asks, "Is Wenski buying at our store?" meaning her father. "Mostly on credit." "Ah," Wokulski sighed with relief. "What is his financial position?" "They say he's quite bankrupt, and that his apartment house will soon be put up for auction later this year." "Well, and Miss Wenska isn't married yet?" "No." "Is she engaged?" "I doubt it. And who today would marry a girl with expensive tastes and no dowry? She's getting older, too, though she's still pretty, naturally enough." Here's the situation. So now Wokulski has a lot of money. There's a woman that he's in love with. And he knows that she's part of the declining aristocracy, part of the declining gentry, and she's really in dire straits. And so he's in a position to, rescue her and rescue the family. And that will put her in an awkward position. So then we, in the next chapter, the democratization of a gentleman and the dreams of a society lady. So what happens is we next get an introduction to the Wenskis. And Tomasz Wenski, the father, wishes to continue as a person of high society, but he can't do that because the aristocracy just is falling apart. So he joins a merchant society, and they're eager to have him because he's a person of older status. So he's old money. So he wants to figure out how can he work his way into this new society. Meanwhile, Isabella wants to keep up appearances, right? I mean, she rejects various suitors who might be able to help her out of her, financial straits, but which she seems not quite cognizant of. She's seen as somebody who's living in, living in a beautiful world is the way that Prus puts it. What kind of person is she? Well, from her cradle, Isabella had lived in a beautiful world that was not only superhuman, but even supernatural, for she slept in feathers, dressed in silks and satins, sat on carved and polished ebony or rosewood, drank from crystal, ate from silver and porcelain as costly as gold. So she's not really aware of how desperate her financial situation, really is. And she's turning away various suitors who might be able to, rescue her from her position. She's even been courted by Victor Emmanuel II, the King of Italy. So she's maintained appearances as a person of high society, but she's not getting any younger. She's not going to have a dowry because her, father is living on credit, and they might have to sell the home. So she has a confidant, Countess Karolova, who will tell her the truth about her situation. She says about her father, "Only you can help him, and so you should." Admittedly, the marshal, one of the suitors, is not an Adonis, but if one's duties were easy to carry out, there would be no need for self-sacrifice. Anyhow, my dear, who can stop us from having some ideal in the depths of our hearts, the thought of which can sweeten the most difficult times? Finally, I can assure you that the position of a pretty woman with an old husband is by no means the worst imaginable. Everyone takes an interest in her, and they all talk about her, pay tribute to her devotion. And yet again, an old husband is less demanding than one in middle age. But aunt, no exultation, Bella, if you please. Bella is short for Isabella. You are not 16 any longer and must take life seriously. You cannot, after all, sacrifice your father's very existence, not to mention that of Flora and your servants, for a mere whim. Finally, do remember how much good you, with your noble heart, might do in controlling a large fortune. Now, Flora, let's see, who is that? I can look at my my list of characters that I have at the back of the book that I've been compiling all along. Oh, Flora is a cousin that lives with the Wenskys, so part of their household. But aunt, the marshal is hideous. It isn't a wife he needs, but a nursemaid to wipe his mouth for him. I don't insist on the marshal, but the baron? The baron is still older. He paints his face, and there are revolting marks on his hands. The countess rose from the sofa. I don't insist, my dear. I'm no matchmaker. Leave that to Mrs. Meliton, another kind of confidant. I merely wish to point out that disaster is hanging over your father's head. So she has, a kind of duty, right? A duty to her family, a duty to her father, and that's the other driving element. On the one hand, you have the sort of Austinian driving element that, we have a man in possession of a fortune, in want of a wife, and then on the other hand, the object of desire is Isabella Wenska, and she has her own motivations. She has to, save herself and save her family by marrying somebody of wealth. And, can she accept Wokulski? Does that fit her worldview? Does that fit her image of herself? Okay, so once we know all of the characters and, what the time and the space of the novel, then, the question is, how are the big issues of the 19th century worked out through these characters? And I think, and Prus has enough space to, deal with a lot of really big questions. I would say that through Wokulski, he's, Wokulski is the dialogic character, the person who we're meant to sympathize with, the person who, is trying to decide between two positions. Rzecki's romanticism on one hand, and, the position that he articulates, but we don't know exactly that he believes, which is a kind of scientific utopianism, or what in Russian literature is called nihilism, absolute belief in objectivity, against emotion. But yet he's a person who has emotions. He's a person who experiences love, and he knows that maybe this isn't rational, but he just can't ignore it. The opposing position to Rzecki is a character named Ochocki, who is the scientific utopian, in the novel. And Wokulski says, at a certain point, thinking about love, well, I can't, follow the models of Mickiewicz or Słowatsky. I just have to think about, what I want and how to achieve it. But yet in another moment, he has like an Anna Karenina moment where he throws himself across a train track. Ironically, karma saves him in a sense. I mean, there's a brakeman who helps him, who pulls him off the track before the train comes. Wokulski asks, well, what are you doing? Can you leave me in peace? And the brakeman says, but don't you recognize me? You helped me get a job a year ago. So Wokulski is, in a sense, he's sometimes quite irrational, despite his expressions of rationality, despite his stated objective of achieving personal happiness, which is something that both he and Isabella are striving for, but maybe they don't know quite how to get there. There's a question of social Darwinism. The last 2 years of my existence, thought Wokulski, have been passed in the pursuit of a woman I might even have rejected if I'd known her better. All my energies, studies, talents, and huge fortune are absorbed into a single emotion because I am in trade and she is an aristocrat. Right? That's the basic problem, social problem between them. Perhaps society, by harming me, harms itself. Here Wokulski reached the apex of his self-criticism. He saw how preposterous his situation was and resolved to extricate himself. What am I to do, though? What am I to do, he thought. Why, the same as everyone else, to be sure. And what did they do? Above all, they worked extraordinarily hard, up to 16 hours a day, regardless of Sundays and holidays, thanks to a selection process here, in which only the strongest had the right to survive. A sickly man would perish before the year was out, an incompetent one within a matter of years, and only the strongest and cleverest were left, right? So, he's trying to think, all right, well, what are, the forces in society to which I must submit, the forces of nature? What is the law of nature here? And how will I best achieve my desires given what the laws of nature are? And for him, that's social Darwinism. The fittest survive. And these things are stated quite explicitly in Prus. So there's really a lot to deal with if you want to write about these topics. Say you're, taking a course on the novel, on the Polish novel, or you're, writing a thesis and you want to deal with, Prus's The Doll, or in the context of, other works. Maybe you're writing in comparative literature, or maybe you're just a reader trying to puzzle through these ideas. And you can find quite a few that are expressed surprisingly explicitly. Other questions that Prus tries to address, for instance, include, the woman question or the question of feminism, which is taking on a new form in the 19th century where women are seeking, for instance, the right to vote, the right to own property, and so forth. Wenska is, Isabella is struggling with this, quite directly, right? I mean, she wonders to herself, is she prostituting herself in some way if she, if her marriage is a vehicle for saving the family? Can't we sell the silver first? And if she does sell the silver, and who buys it? Wokulski. So this is another thing that's going on, in the background, right? That she's imagining that she's engaging in some kind of self, actualization, but yet, in some way she's, unbeknownst to herself, playing into Wokulski's ploy. Can she, retain her dignity as a human, as a person, while partaking in marriage, right? Her counterpart is Mrs. Meliton in the novel, who's kind of a Machiavellian, right? I mean, she says, well, a woman must be subdued by power and so forth. But she has her own power, right? And she never marries. but gets what she wants, except for money. She's a poor governess, but she's never. She says she's never saved by a prince or a baron. Other, sort of big issues in the novel, the Jewish question, right? There's a character Lisiecki who is sort of absurdly anti-Semitic. I mean, is a parody of an anti-Semite. But yet, as far as Prus makes these these parodies. There are Jewish characters who are sympathetic. There are, but there are also Jewish stereotypes, that are, appear in the novel, right? There's this idea of kind of a Jewish system, but Prus is not ignorant of everything that's going on in the Jewish world, right? I mean, he's able to distinguish between Orthodox and secular, and maybe comparing this to Raymon's The Peasants, which we read in an earlier episode of the program, where there are a number of anti-Semitic stereotypes that just can't be denied, as seemingly sympathetic as Raymond may be. Even such that in our if you remember our Singer episode, we talked about how Singer takes an episode from Raymond and works it into one of his own stories. That's a kind of a paradox. So you might look at Jews in various 19th century Polish novels. I'm sure it's been done, but everybody writes about a topic in their own way. I think scholars worry too much about being derivative or not having new ideas, where by virtue of what you've read, what what you've experienced, the time in which you live, everything will be your own idea. You just have to have confidence in yourself to put these ideas out on paper. I think that's important. Another thing about this is one of the great novels of Warsaw. If you want to, appreciate what Warsaw was like in the 19th century before World War I and before it was completely destroyed in World War II, almost completely destroyed, read The Doll as a novel of Warsaw. I mean, there are, Wokulski makes these walks through the city, and you can see some of the streets have had their 19th century names restored after communism, after Nazism, when streets were renamed, and you can trace those on a contemporary map. Of course, some of the streets have moved because so much of Warsaw was destroyed, but during the war. But the streets, around Krakowskie Przedmieście, Oboźnie, where Krakowskie Przedmieście number 4 is, where you can find the plaque that says, Wokulski lived here, even though Wokulski is a fictional character who never lived anywhere. You can trace his walks on those streets, and then you can compare them with other novels of Warsaw. Right? You can look at go back to our episode on Leopold Tyrmand when we look at The Man with the White Eyes, or Zły, which is evil, but called The Man with the White Eyes in English, in its English translation. Unfortunately, the extant English translation as of 2025 leaves out a lot of the passages that make that novel a great novel of Warsaw, where the narrator reflects on various landscapes. They're kind of landscape scenes or cityscape scenes. And I guess some editor decided that maybe those are too boring or they don't contribute to the action of the mystery plot in Zły. So they cut those out of the English version. But eventually, go back. I read one of them in that Tyrmand episode. Or you might look at something like Isaac Bashevis Singer's collection of stories in my father's court, which is set in Warsaw. Those are, and there are others, but these are all like, if you love Warsaw, these are all fascinating things to study and to think about, even if you're not writing about them. And then you might think about, what is the economy of information in a city? It's, go back to that beginning chapter, right, where we get this overheard conversation. There's a lot of exchange of information. For instance, there's Isabella finds out that Wokulski has bought the house. Right? She doesn't know it at first, but it's revealed through a letter, right? So that's part of how information is exchanged in 19th century Warsaw, under urban conditions. We get a lot of gossip. There's a lot of gossip and spreading of rumors. We get images of the theater, the court, and public space. Right, those are other places where information is exchanged, and we get an idea of being at home in the city. What makes Wokulski, feel at home in the city? He says in Warsaw. Or the narrator says, in Warsaw, he didn't come to himself until he was riding in a droshki in Aleja Jerozolimskie. But who had carried his valise for him, and how had he got himself to the droshki? This he did not know, and it did not even matter to him. I mean, the idea of like just riding through the city streets, he feels like, he's part of the lifeblood of Warsaw when he does that. That sense of being at home, I think that's important. And you might, if you were writing about this, if I were writing about this, I would probably look at that and say, well, when are the characters at home in Warsaw immediately after the war in Tirmanzwy or on Krochmalna Street in Singer? Those would be all questions. What is the idea of home? One interesting question always to me is, especially in the novel, is the realist novel, the psychological novel, the 19th century novel especially, is what are people reading? Right? And how do they read? Because that tells you something about what the author's expectations are for their readers. At the beginning of chapter 6, it's about 5 p.m. Isabella is in her boudoir reading Zola's latest novel, A Page of Love. So this is, she's reading, naturalism. She reads inattentively, every now and then raising her eyes to gaze out of the window, half-consciously thinking that the branches of the trees are black and the sky gray. Then she reads on or looks round the boudoir and half-consciously thinks that her furniture, covered with that sky-blue material and her blue gown, have a sort of grayish tinge, and that the loops of her white curtains are like great icicles, that she forgets what she was thinking and wonders, what was I thinking of? Ah, the Easter collection. Then suddenly she feels like taking a carriage drive, and at the same time regrets that the sky is so gray, that its gilded veins are so narrow. She is tormented by almost imperceptible uneasiness and expectancy, but is not sure what it is she is waiting for, whether for the clouds to part or for the footman to come with a letter inviting her to take part in the Easter collection. It is very soon now, but she is not yet invited to take part. So maybe Prus is saying a little something about naturalism here, saying something about Zola. She sits down to read Zola, and she's completely distracted. She wants to take part in some sort of social event. And then, it kind of goes on, and, she sets aside Zola, and she picks up a fashion magazine, and she starts thinking about that. And then she feels guilty about looking at the fashion magazine. So she picks up, what does she pick up? Is it a prayer book or the Bible? Yeah, she picks up a prayer book and starts reading that because that seems maybe more virtuous to her. And we get a picture of 19th century boredom. Right. And that is its own, kind of thing. Right. I mean, we think of like, well, the novel is supposed to be presenting action and plot, but boredom is part of our experience. Right. If we read a 600-page novel, we're forgetting stuff all the time and we can't keep it all straight. That's why, when we're reading, for the purpose of writing. We have to make notes. We have to write things down. But our natural experience, I think, of reading something so long is like our experience of day-to-day life, because we don't remember everything that happens to us, and likewise, we're not going to remember everything that happens in the novel, and the characters within the novel are not going to remember everything that happens to them and everything that they do, and they're going to be distracted. Isabella's having a conversation about who she should marry. Should she marry the marshal, like this wealthy character that she finds revolting, or a tradesman, somebody of the merchant class, somebody like Wokulski, although Wokulski isn't mentioned yet. And Flora, and she's very despondent, and Isabella thinks, no, none of these people are people I want to be with. And Flora says, "Really, Bella, you exaggerate with your willpower, your ingenuity." And then she responds, "You do not know such people, but I have seen them at work. They can crush iron bars in their bare hands. They are terrible. They know how to move all earthly powers, which we are not even aware of, to suit their own ends. They can smash us, snare us, grovel before us, risk everything, and even wait patiently." And then she says, Flora says, "You talk like a novel." That's a very interesting kind of response. That she's exaggerating, she's projecting from things maybe that she's read, not really her own experience, but Isabella thinks it's her own experience because she's so immersed in it, and maybe that's a little irony in Prus about how we read, how we should read, how we in fact read, we identify. We immerse ourselves in the work so that we feel like it's our own experience sometimes, even when it's not. In the case of the doll, I mean, when you look at how you look at things like that plaque dedicated to the place where Wokulski lived, supposedly, it's as if like a whole city has so identified with the novel that that they believe the characters are real. That's what realism is, right? I mean, it's the novel is written in the newspaper adjacent to articles about real life, and then there you are. It seems like yet another element of real life that's happening. Well, we didn't have time really to unpack all 600-700 pages of the doll, but I think this gives us a few different ways in and ways to think about reading and how we read and how we should read. As I always say, hang on. Please subscribe and click the bell to stay on top of the program. Watch the credits for some recommendations about how you can support aid for Ukraine and for Ukrainians fleeing the war in their country. I'd like to thank all the people who helped make this series possible. The Polish Cultural Institute New York sponsors our program. Bartek Remisko, head of Humanities and Literature at the Polish Cultural Institute New York, is our executive producer. Natalia Iyudin is my fellow producer and editor. Our opening and closing music is by Radek Przedpełski. Thank you all for listening and for reading along with us. Let's meet again in a month when we'll be discussing another interesting topic in Polish and Ukrainian literature. See you then.
Jest to szary dzień, jak zawsze w tej okolicy. Cała sceneria wydaje się chwilami fotografią z ilustrowanej gazety. Tak szare, tak płaskie są domy, ludzie i pojazdy.